welcome back to Bristol Talks Economics. It's good to see so many of you here. And this week we're welcoming Professor John Turner of Finance and Financial History at Queen's University, Belfast. He's also an editor of the journal The Economic History Review and the Economics Observatory. But most importantly, for the purposes of this evening, he is the co-author of Boom and Bust, A Global History of Financial Bubbles. I personally really enjoyed this book, but you don't have to take my word for it, because the Financial Times named it as one of their best books of 2020. So hello, John. Hope you're ready for an effervescent discussion, I guess, with bubbles. But I'm going to start off by asking, so what sort of inspired you to go not into finance but into financial history, which is, I guess, a more specialized subset of the field?
Okay, well, first of all, let me say thank you very much, Anna, for having me along to talk tonight, and welcome everyone. It's been a tough year for students, and it's great to see so many students here tonight. So I hope you enjoy the session that we have. So the story's a rather long one, Anna. I got really interested in economics as a kid. As I said, some kids are interested in rocks, some are interested in stargazing, some get interested in collecting Pokemon cards. I was interested in economics. I grew up in the 1970s, and lots of strikes were going on, and fascinated by strikes. Why were people on strike? And trying to process this as a young kid. And then the eureka moment happened for me when I was in primary 3. This was in 1979. So I grew up on a town on the border. So I lived in the north of Ireland, Northern Ireland, and right on the border. And so there were kids who would come over from the south of Ireland, Republic of Ireland, to school in the north. And in 1979, the pound and the punt, the Irish punt at the time, basically were no longer joined one for one. The punt was on a free float. And one of my best friends at school was a guy called Tony Hart. He came into class and we had to pay in our dinner money every 2 weeks. And I would bring in a pound note. Yes, such things did exist. And he would bring in his punt note. And that's what happened until this event in 1979. He had to bring in more than a punt. And I was fascinated. I was hooked on economics from that point onwards. And then my interest grew because I also lived in a town that had it was infamous because it was Western Europe's unemployment black spot. So unemployment in the town when I was growing up was 50%, and male unemployment was actually a lot higher than that. It was possibly closer to about 70%. And so my interest was growing. And then along came Mrs. Thatcher. Now, Mrs. Thatcher is not someone that's loved by a lot of people, but if you were a young person growing up in the 1980s, it was revolutionary what she was doing, and looking at what she did to the economy, particularly with privatization. And so I was at a very young age, as a teenager, buying shares in all of these companies that were being privatized. The Trustees Savings Bank, which had been a mutual association, floated on the stock exchange, and I, as a depositor in that, I got shares, and I was hooked. And so that's what really got me interested then in finance. And so I moved to university. I studied economics. I studied finance, and I took those through to master's level. And it was really only when I got into my PhD that I became really interested in financial history. And my PhD was looking at the evolution of the British banking system, particularly the evolution of regulation within the British banking system. So that's what really got me hooked then on financial history. And I've been living and breathing financial history then for the past 25 years, Anna.
Fantastic. I mean, you've mentioned several major economic events there, and I'm sure a lot of our audience will maybe their first economic memory is the subprime bubble, which we're obviously going to talk a lot about later. But let's get back to the book. And so you started this project in 2016 with your colleague William Quinn, and so what sort of drove you to think this is we need a book about the history of bubbles and this is how we're going to approach it?
Okay, so I've done a little bit of work on bubbles throughout my career, but it's mainly been my PhD students who have been interested in bubbles, and so I've supervised several dissertations looking at bubbles. And my co-author in the book, Will Quinn, was a former PhD student, and he wrote his dissertation on something called the bicycle bubble. So I've always had this interest in bubbles, but I've also lived through at least 3 bubbles. And this has got me super, super interested. So back in 1999-2000, I was a young lecturer. I was teaching on an executive MBA class, and I was the youngest person in the class. They were all bankers, doctors, stockbrokers, senior civil servants in the class. And they were all buying shares in these new .com companies such as lastminute.com, companies such as FreeServe. And they were saying, John, you should be buying these shares in these companies. And I was saying, no, I've seen this before. This looks like a bubble. And so they kept, every week they would come in and say, you got to be buying this, or I've had this tip. And I kept saying, this is going to burst, guys. And so the Easter break came, we took Easter break back. After Easter break, the market had begun to tumble, and the .com bubble had burst. And so I lived through that bubble, and I didn't invest in it, thankfully. The next bubble I lived through was then the housing bubble that occurred in the UK, but really hit Ireland and really hit Northern Ireland in the 2000s. And the first whiff that I had that something was wrong was back in 2002. I was selling the first house that I'd ever bought, and it was like a small starter home. And there were people coming to view my home. And when you're selling a home, you're trying to figure out, well, how much are people willing to pay for it? And will they actually follow through if they make an offer? And so you're trying to suss this out. And so you're trying to suss this out with everyone coming to see your home. And, there were people there. And I was saying to my wife, how are these people going to afford to pay for this property? And it turned out that many of them, and they were all telling me they were getting 100% mortgages. So all of a sudden, my alarm bells are going in my head. And then I watched the housing bubble over the next 4 to 5 years as house prices in Belfast, where I live, quadrupled. My own house that I bought in 2002 quadrupled in price over that period of time. And so I got all of a sudden fascinated. And then the final bubble that I experienced was in 2015 in China. So I was dean of our management school at Queen's in 2015, and I was going out to meet some alumni in Shenzhen. So it's one of China's financial capitals, fascinating city. And they were in the middle of a massive bubble, a bubble that I write about in the book. And I was talking to taxi drivers through translators who were talking about buying shares. I met up with some former PhD students who worked in an investment bank in Shenzhen, and they were telling me about the escalation of share prices and just the craze that was taking place in Shenzhen at the time. And I just got so excited just living through that and experiencing that. And it's those experiences that made me think, no one's really sat down and looked historically at all of these bubbles and tried to explain why they happened. So that was really where the drive for the book came from, Anna.
That's fantastic. And you sort of touched upon some of the themes that run through this book. So expansion of credit with the 100% mortgages, speculation, taxi drivers and the getting involved in financial markets, and marketability. I guess all your friends like telling you buy. So basically these are the size of what you call the bubble triangle. Can you tell us a bit about how you developed that theory? Yeah.
So if you like to think of bubble is the word bubble is a metaphor that we have applied to financial markets, to housing markets, and it's a bit of an unsatisfactory metaphor, and so we spell out in the book why we think it is. We thought that fire was a much better metaphor for bubbles. So we talk about the fire triangle. So those of you who've studied chemistry at school will remember the fire triangle. There's 3 sides to it. So for a fire, you need heat, you need oxygen, and you need fuel, and you need a spark then to set the process off. And so in our book, we use this metaphor of the fire triangle to help explain why bubbles happen. So there's 3 sides. The first side is speculation. And so this is the heat in the bubble triangle. And speculation is where in these bubbles you see novices coming to invest in the market, people who don't know very much about investing. They're simply buying shares because the prices are going up. And so during bubbles, or one of the warning signs that we're in a bubble is you actually see a lot of amateur speculators. So that was the first side, speculation. Second side is the fuel side, or the money and credit side of the bubble triangle. So this is where two things could be going on here. So with low interest rates, people begin to reach for yield. Investors begin to reach for yield. Walter Bagehot, who's a former editor of The Economist back 150 odd years ago, said, investors, or John Bull, as he talked about, can withstand many things, but they can't stand 2%. And so he's saying basically when interest rates are super low, investors are reaching into riskier assets. So you've got that reaching for yield phenomenon. But also with low interest rates, if that's tied into easy credit conditions, all of a sudden investors can borrow to buy the house, the stock, or the bubble asset. And then the third side, the final side of the bubble triangle, is the oxygen side, or the marketability, the ease with which we can buy and sell shares or houses. And one of the things we track, one of the narrative arcs in the book, is we discuss how marketability over time has increased and increased and increased and increased, and it becomes so much easier to buy and sell stocks. So that's the three sides. So speculation, marketability, money, and fuel. But every fire needs a spark. And so one of the things we talk about then in the book is what sparks off these bubbles. And we have two things that we talk about: technology. So some radical new technology comes along and that sparks off the speculation. Or more likely, it's some government policy that comes along. So the government does something and that sparks off the speculation, and then we get the bubble emerging.
Yes.
So that's in a nutshell.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. And so I think, the spark of technology in particular has, sort of like really inspired some of these comments. So there's lots of talk about cryptocurrency, which you do cover in the book. But great. And so, God, I've lost my train of thought. So speculation based on technology, you actually sort of like, we generally regard, bubbles as being, big events that lead to depressions. But in the book, you cover some bubbles, particularly those sparked by technology, which are actually quite beneficial.
Yeah, so again, it goes back to the fire metaphor. So some fires are destructive, but some fires in some terrains can actually revitalize the terrain. So in some savannas, for example, in some types of forests, fires are actually part of the revitalization process and can actually bring benefits. So we use that metaphor. So you get some bubbles where they actually are really, really useful. So we this technological sparks. So two of the examples for it, that we have in the book. So one is the bicycle mania. The bicycle mania is super transformative of society, because all of a sudden we've got this modern technology, our modern bicycle. And a lot of the companies that go into bicycle manufacturing then actually move into other types of manufacturing. So a lot of motor car manufacturers, a lot of motorcycle manufacturers, airplane manufacturers all came out of bicycle manufacturers. So a little known fact, the Wright brothers, for example, in America, started off as bicycle manufacturers. And so there's a bubble that actually didn't cause much in the way of destruction, but proved really useful. And one of the other interesting upsides of that bubble was in terms of all these bicycles were produced, and all of a sudden all of these people could afford to buy this radical new technology, and it really transformed things for women in the UK. All of a sudden they could go about cities in safety, and it transformed and radicalized a lot of women. So you see that sort of upside. And then the .coms, the other really famous example of this. This technology that we're using tonight. I can remember, when I was a student, and you've probably heard people say this, your parents, no doubt. When I was a student, there's no such thing as emails, no such thing as laptops, no such thing as mobile phones. How did we survive? I don't know. But this new technology, the internet, is a fantastic technology. It's transformed how we work. It's transformed how we live. And here was a bubble, and we got this radical new information communications technology that has really transformed the world that we know. So those are some examples of bubbles that have produced, an upside.
Yeah, no, these are great examples. So I think what this sort of like the innovation side of bubble, sort of, do you think this is kind of, you talk a bit at the beginning, as you mentioned, about the sort of definition of what a bubble is. Do you think that, you know, bubbles creating this sort of value, which maybe isn't necessarily like, you know, appreciated at the time of the bubble, do you think that's what kind of undermines maybe the definition of bubble, where markets, shares in markets are overvalued, as opposed to just the more empirical definition you go for with a rapid rise and crash in prices?
Yeah, so this is one of the big debates in finance. You know, what actually is a bubble, and do bubbles really exist? And so you'll get people like Eugene Fama, who, you know, Nobel Prize winner in economics. He says the word bubble drives him completely nuts. You've got other people who try to define bubbles in terms of fundamental value. So they're connected to the cash flows attached to the asset, the rental income from a house, for example. But we plumped, and I'm pretty confident that in what we've done here, we plumped with Charles Kinderberger, who is the father of manias and crashes, very famous economic historian, well worth reading. And he defined a bubble as an upward movement of prices over an extended range that then implodes. And so people around Kinderberger who've been influenced by him, people like Will Getzman at Yale, they try to parameterize, this idea of bubbles. And that's what we followed in the book. And not everyone's going to like that, but that's what we did in the book.
Yes, so you mentioned this sort of like the rejection by some economists of the term of bubble. Throughout the book, you sort of like see a lot of, you know, sort of like the social reaction to bubbles, where, you know, it's sort of like seen, you know, not entirely unjustifiably as gambling. It's something that's immoral. Do you think part of that is, you know, the sort of tendency, part of the rejection is the tendency for people to see bubbles as sort of like moral and sort of like describe them as irrational, rather than actually trying to like analyze where they come from?
Yeah, so let me pick up on a couple of things there that you've asked, a couple of really interesting questions there. In terms of rationality, we think a lot of economists have got a very high bar in terms of rationality, and so we've deliberately downplayed the role of irrationality or rationality in bubbles. We don't think people are that dumb. We don't think that people are that irrational. So we downplay that. But in terms of the morality piece, that's a really interesting piece, because from a couple of angles. Okay, so one of the angles that we look at is this idea of short selling. Okay, so if you think an asset's overvalued, well, you can take advantage of that and make money from that by short selling the asset, borrowing it and then selling it and then buying it back at a later date. And so one of the things we observe throughout time is that there's a real hatred in the press and from other investors and from company directors towards short sellers. And that still exists, that sort of antagonism towards short sellers, even though short sellers may actually be providing something of benefit to wider society. So there's that moralizing, and we really see that, there's a few court cases that we talk about where a few short sellers were caught out and weren't able to pay up, and you can really see that moral tone. But the most interesting thing that we saw in terms of this idea of speculation and gambling was when Australia had its booming crash in the 1880s and then into the 1890s. And the moralizing tone of the British press, and so British investors have pumped a lot of money into Australia, but they basically said Australia's a nation of gamblers. What do you expect? Was really the sort of tone of it. And so if there's anyone from Australia, you'll recognize this moral tone that comes from Britain. And it's interesting that even today in Australia, for example, the idea of gambling, Australian people don't have any problem with the idea of gambling. It's, you've got the so-called pokies round every street corner. In terms of the amount spent on gambling to GDP, Australia has the largest percent spent on gambling relative to GDP of any nation. So it's still within the sort of the DNA of Australia, but there was great moralising at the time when their bubble crashed back in the 1880s and 1890s.
It's actually interesting because I actually got into an argument with my brother about short selling, and his tone was very like, it's not right for people to profit off other people's misfortune. So I definitely buy that sort of prejudice, I suppose, still exists. So something I wanted to pick up there is the tone of the press, and something I found interesting throughout the book is, so after the Latin American bubble that you described, that sort of like prompted the birth of the financial press. But every subsequent bubble, there was some sort of failure within financial journalism. And it's not just like through corruption, although corruption did exist, but can you talk a bit about this like incentives of the press, why that might, mean that they don't accurately report on bubbles?
Yeah, so one of the things, again, as we're writing the book in each chapter, we looked at the role of the media, of the press. I have a sideline interest in the role of the media in financial markets and how they influence financial markets and how they can move financial markets. But in the book, we looked at the media, the fourth estate, to see, because there's this idea that, they play a very important role in terms of reporting on financial matters. So when we're looking at bubbles, we really want to think about what are the incentives that the press or the media face. Okay, so one side could be they want to build a reputation as purveyors of truth and exposers of financial folly. And you see this in the UK, for example, with the Times and with the Economist during something called the Railway Mania, which happened in the mid-1840s. They called the bubble well before, several months before it burst, and they called it. And they actually built up their reputation as reputable financial journalists because they called that bubble. And so some parts of the press have wanted to maintain that reputation as purveyors of truth and exposers of financial policy. You see that with, the Financial Times, for example. Then you also have, in some bubbles, what we call venal journalism. And this is where the journalists are basically reporting what the puffers of the bubble want them to report. And this is usually where you have state-controlled press. So, for example, in 1719, 1720, a large bubble called the Mississippi bubble in Paris, and it was being puffed by the French press, by the Parisian press, which was state-controlled. Similarly, in 2007, 2015, we had bubbles in China and the Chinese stock market. And again, these are being puffed. These are being talked up by the state-owned press. And in fact, it goes further in China because they attempt to control social media. And so there's also the Chinese control of social media trying to talk up bubbles. And then the other incentive is access to information. So journalists need access to information to be able to report on things. And the complexity of some bubbles actually made it very difficult for journalists to report on. And I think that was true for the housing bubble of the 2000s. The complexity of some of the instruments, for example, some economists couldn't get their heads around, never mind journalists. And so there is that issue. And finally, there is this idea of the incentives in terms of advertising revenue. Okay, so where does the press get its revenue from? So the interesting thing that happened in the 2000s in countries that had housing bubbles, such as Spain, Ireland, the United States, UK to a lesser degree, was the regional press, the business model changed. The internet had essentially destroyed the regional press, and they were heavily reliant on income from house builders, house sellers, estate agents. And they had no incentive to talk down bubbles. And so one of my former PhD students, he did his whole PhD looking at the role of the press in the build up to the housing bubble of the 2000s. And the coverage expands tenfold of the press of the UK housing market and of the Irish housing market and the Spanish housing market. And the press typically are talking up these markets. So there's advertising revenue, that really drives a lot of the press. And so you've always got to ask yourself, what's the incentive of the press when they're reporting on bubbles? Can I can I trust them? And the final thing that we talk about in the book is the development. So for most bubbles, it's been the printed press, it's been newspapers, but you come to the .com, the housing bubble, and more recently, you've now got a new media. You've got television. You've got 24-hour financial news networks in the United States. You've got these docu-soaps where people are, I think it was called Flip My Home or Flip My House in the United States. And, we had all sorts of varieties of it in the UK. These amateurs who become property speculators. And, we sort of, then that seeps into the popular mind and people say, oh, I could do that. And so that influence on people as well, I think was particularly detrimental.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So you've talked a bit there about amateurs and also a bit about sort of politically engineered in Mississippi and China as well. So I think, okay, so this was going to come off eventually, I think. So a lot of the narrative around the GameStop bubble was about how this was, sort of ordinary people, amateurs, sort of like taking on Wall Street and sort of like, sticking it to the man, I guess. Because like the perception of the last few bubbles, say the subprime one, the .com one, you talk about the Japanese one where, there's a lot of sort of collusion in the big banks, there's a sort of hangover from sort of the former feudal culture. So can you like speak to, but again, time and time again, you sort of like talk about, amateurs getting involved in the stock market, like massive like presses against, like runs on sort of like stock exchanges. So so do you think, like we should kind of like open up financial markets to people again, or do you think, it's kind of better that it's kind of we're protecting people from that sort of risk?
Oh yeah. So again, one of the sort of arcs within the book is what we call the democratization of speculation. So, you go back to 1720, it's only the really wealthy people who are participating in bubbles. And if they lose money, so what? You come into the mid 1840s, then the middle classes are being drawn into bubbles. You come into the Wall Street bubble of the 1920s, all of a sudden, lower middle class savers in the United States are investing in stock markets. And then increasingly over time, and one of the exciting things we document, of course, is in China. And the participation in China of ordinary savers, of people with not very much money in the stock market is it helps drive these. And you would have to think they're possibly being taken advantage of. So then the question is, should we be stopping people investing their money? I don't think we should be doing that. But at the same time, there is this. People should be very aware and very careful about how they invest.
Thank you. And so I have one more question before I sort of hand it over to the audience. And thank you. You've been very active and there are lots of questions. So my question is about so the size of the bubbles, are all things that sort of have to exist for a healthy stock market. As you just said, speculation, we need some of that to, like keep things going. So so you talk about how in the book this implies, that we can't really predict bubbles without being able to predict the technology and sort of like political sparks that start off bubbles. So do you think, there should be like sort of interventions to like sort of see where sort of potential bubbles are coming from? Do you think we should attempt to predict these sort of fairly random sparks?
Okay, so I think there's two parts.
That's two questions.
Yeah, it's two parts. So can we predict bubbles? And then if we can predict them, should we do anything about them? And so we end the book, and well, our editor told us to be a bit more upbeat when it came to it. But I think bubbles are really hard to predict. So we can see what we call the necessary conditions, the three sides of the bubble triangle. And if I look at the market today, I see those three sides. I see lots of speculation. I see very marketable shares. So you can go to Robinhood today and pay zero commission. You can buy fractions of shares. That's super marketable. I see a lot of reaching for yield because interest rates are so low, and also online brokers are offering really good terms in terms of people being able to borrow to buy stocks. So is there a spark today? It's really hard to see these in real time, and it's really only after the event that we can really truly understand it. And that's me, the historian, I think, talking there. So if we could predict bubbles, should we do anything about it? Well, I think we also have quite a pessimistic tone there, because a lot of these bubbles that we've seen in history are engineered by governments, and so they don't want to do anything about it. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that if we have a technological bubble, should we do anything about it? Should we try and stop it from, going up in flames? That also can be very dangerous because, we talk about this in the book. One famous example of where a government did, or a central bank tried to pop a bubble, was in Germany in 1927. So they went in, they popped the bubble, and it had quite dramatic consequences for the German economy, and tipped Germany into quite a deep recession in the late 1920s. And then we know what happened in Germany after that. And so there are some dangers of trying to pop bubbles. And so for policymakers, well, try and not sort of puff the thing up in the first place, I suppose would be the advice. But if there's a technological bubble, or what looks like a technological bubble going, you clean up afterwards. You don't try and pop it. You clean up afterwards is really the advice that we have in the book.
So we're going to hand over to audience questions now. We've got Richard here to do that. Thank you for coming along, Richard.
Okay, thank you, Anna.
I just want to start off with one here, and related to the last answer you gave, where I understand why this might be a bit hard to get your head around, but why would a government engineer a bubble?
Yeah, so the thing in the book that we really get into is that there's no grand socioeconomic theory as to why governments would do this. In each occasion that we look at where bubbles do engineer it, they've just got something that they want to do. So, for example, I think the best example I can use is China. So back in 2007, China was wanting to privatize. Well, it already had privatized quite a lot of its firms, but the government still owned most of the shares in these firms, and China was under pressure to basically float these. And so to encourage people to buy the shares, because people at the time were very reluctant, the Chinese government engineered a bubble in the stock market. So this got people excited, and this enabled them to offload their shares. In the 2000s bubble, we talk about it as it's not an engineered bubble, but it certainly was a result of government policy. It happened, so the housing bubble didn't happen in every country. It happened in Spain, it happened in Ireland, to a lesser degree in the UK, it happened in the United States. These four countries all wanted to provide social housing through the private sector. They all wanted to encourage people to buy their own homes. They all wanted to encourage the financial sector to lend to individuals at really cheap rates and on really easy credit terms. And because of this desire to push the private sector to do this, they created the largest housing bubble that we've ever seen. So that it wasn't deliberately engineered in that sense, but it was a result of government policy. And the very first bubble, 1720, was engineered essentially to help the French government, to help the English government or the British government to reduce their debt burden. They were just simply trying to reduce their debt after many years of war. And that's essentially why they engineered that bubble.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, I was hoping you'd mention Mississippi because I found it fascinating as I was reading the last chapter a couple of days ago, where you draw the sort of like parallels between the most recent bubble and then like the first bubble you talk about. And I just thought history sort of worked out, providing nice bookings for you there. But Richard, are there any questions here that stood out to you? I know you've been interacting.
There are a lot, and thanks so much for joining us, John. Sorry not to be there at the start. I had a slight technical issue. I did see it, but I can let you see me. Loads of people on the call and loads of questions. So I'll take over for a few minutes and let Anna read some of them. But a common theme which I'll sort of try and distill down a little bit, is people essentially trying to get you to predict, have we got a bubble? Which is obviously very difficult, and you've spent some time on already. But I wondered if we could kind of differentiate between three sort of different types of ideas, because all of those ideas are there in your book. Yes, they're all there in your book, actually. So the first one is a technology-based bubble. So somebody asked about Tesla. So when we look at financial crises, it's something that I'm interested in as well. And it's why I was so fascinated by your book. Often bubbles are based about an exciting new technology or an exciting new opportunity. What would have to happen? So this is the first question. What would sort of have to happen with, let's say, AI and driverless cars for people to think, actually, this is not such a good investment? So that's the first sort of type of bubble, I guess. The second one is, and we've touched on this a little bit, but I wonder if we could dig into it a bit more. You talked about Robinhood. There's also eToro, this new idea post-COVID, which people have touched on in the questions, of the sort of armchair investor. It's the combination sort of, I would say, penny stocks, old-fashioned penny stocks, with social networks and the ability for people to copy trade. Now, does that change the nature of bubbles? If everybody's copying, we know that herd behavior is a thing. And then the third one, and I realized we could take a whole hour just on these three questions, is the new thing, which many of the people you talk about in your book, Walter Bagehot, for example, wouldn't have thought of. They would have known of those previous two bubbles, but they wouldn't, I don't think, have thought of crypto. So lots of people have asked about this. So what is your view? Bitcoin, I think, has gone from about $8,000 to about 50,000 in the past year. And then there's also Ethereum and smart contracts and that whole world. So those three things, again, sort of technology, the armchair investor, and then this sort of futuristic world of crypto.
Yeah, so let me think about the tech bubble first of all. So I think there's two things going on here. First of all, do we have a radical new technology? And the radical new technology, I don't know if it's driverless cars or AI. I think it's the battery. It's the ability to move away from from petrol, from diesel, and I think that's the revolutionary thing that Tesla have. And as I was writing the book, I was in Australia to write one of the chapters, and I was at one of these sort of exhibitions in Melbourne, and Tesla were at the exhibition, and they weren't there to exhibit their car. They were there to exhibit their battery technology, because the South Australia government at that time had just signed a contract. So you've got all these solar cells generating electricity. Where do you store it? Well, Tesla had the solution. And so I think if there's something, it's with that part of the technology. But there's also then a political element to this, because there is this then political push towards green technology. So we've got the confluence of the technology and the political push. So these two things could be driving this technological bubble to some extent. In terms of like Robinhood, eToro, the armchair investor, the millennial investor, the Betfair investor, you might also want to refer to them as, so that you can do this all on your mobile device. It's relatively easy to do, And
just John, just to come in there, because somebody's asked an extra question on this. Yeah. So because you talk about this, the fractionalization of share ownership is not new. And you've already discussed that. So the idea that you don't have to be some landed gentry to form a partnership to invest in companies. We have joint stock companies that then allows more and more people to invest. So I don't think that side of it may have been sped up, but it's not necessarily new. But the thing people are interested in is the sort of social network side, which is both affecting the news media people consume. And it also means you've got great information on some of these sites of what literally your Facebook friends are investing in. As an expert in bubbles, do you see that and we know herd behavior is a thing, so everybody piling into one thing, might that not magnify the next bubble? If everyone's consuming the same news, everyone thinks the same stock is hot, you get a larger kind of piling into a particular sector or company.
Yeah, certainly with the mainstream press, you get more divergence of opinion. But with social media, you might get, as you say, more of a herding tendency. And so everyone gravitates around this one idea, particularly if social media is being manipulated. And we can't really rule out that possibility, because it's so much easier to manipulate social media than to manipulate the mainstream press. So yeah, this could certainly magnify and actually bring in more amateur investors into stock markets. And when I meet people who have given up their jobs to be day traders, I'm in despair, because you're not going to make, the vast majority of people are not going to make money day trading. And so I'm really concerned about this. And there of course there are wider concerns around people's mental well-being, and some really sad stories around the case of Robinhood, where people have lost money and then hurt themselves. So yeah, I would be worried that that's just bringing more and more investors into the market. Cryptocurrency. So here's a plug for the Economics Observatory. So you might want to go read a piece written on cryptocurrency and other digital currencies by my co-author on the book, Will Quinn. Will is a bit of a cryptocurrency. He goes into these subcultures and has done a lot of work on Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. And as we were writing the book, of course, the first Bitcoin bubble was happening, and so the price of Bitcoin was going up and collapsing. And we address this in the conclusion to the book. It's a complete mystery to me as to why people invest in Bitcoin. Bitcoin is not the currency of the future. Bitcoin is not a medium of exchange. It's not a good store of value. It's not money. The studies, the serious academic studies that have been done looking at Bitcoin, show that 70 to 80% of transactions in Bitcoin or other digital currencies are actually around criminality. So it has a value because of that. But you would have to say that there's something really, and Will would actually go as far as saying there's a Ponzi scheme or a fraud actually at play with Bitcoin. I don't know if I would personally go that far. I think this is just speculative excess, people reaching for yield, and people getting caught up on social media with investing in all sorts of cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin.
Very, very interesting. So I've just posted into the chat a link to the Economics Observatory. If you look for cryptocurrency there, you can find some articles that John was just mentioning. Moving to something like slightly more mainstream, perhaps, and my old job as a central banker, a few people have asked in the chat about two things. I'll link two things. So today we've been learning about bubbles this week, which is why it's great you're here. We talked about leverage. And somebody's asked, is the level of leverage investors choose linked with the creation of a financial bubble? And do high leverage investments cause negative externalities that should be addressed by the government? And then linked to that, I think there's a big parallel. I hope you agree there's a big parallel. Could you comment on the post-2008 re-regulation of banks? I'm particularly thinking, because it's the main stuff we've covered, about sort of capital rather than liquidity regulations, and what that means about leverage, and what that in turn means about the volatility we should see from the main high street banks, really.
Mm. So yeah, leverage. So we try and differentiate between bubbles that do no harm, bubbles that are actually beneficial, and bubbles that are detrimental. And the bubbles that are detrimental have two things going for them. They have a political spark, but they have bank leverage underpinning them. And the more bank leverage, the greater the bubble, and then also the greater the sort of the aftermath. So leverage is it really sort of, the fire just, it's like throwing petrol cans on top of fires. The fire just burns so much more because of it. And then the destruction is so much more because of it. So leverage is detrimental. So think, the Japanese bubble, it burst in 1990. Think the subprime bubble. Think Australian bubble that we talk about. Most people haven't heard of, but it was essentially driven by bank leverage, and half the Australian banks collapsed after that bubble burst. So yeah, leverage is super dangerous. Now, the question then is really about the re-regulation of the banking system after 2008. So we've asked banks essentially to put more skin in the game by having more capital. The big question is whether that's enough capital. And we can do all the stress tests we want, but really until a big event comes along, we don't really know. And there's an economist that I would encourage you to look up called Anata Mate, who's based at Stanford. And she's a fantastic economist. And she has really been pushing for much more stringent bank regulation, for banks to actually have more capital, to have more skin in the game. And I'm kind of coming from that school of thought. I think banks need to have more skin in the game. And this comes from the first book that I wrote, which was published back in 2014, which takes this really long look at, British banking. Why was it stable for such a long period of time? And then why did it collapse? And it was stable for two reasons. One is either shareholders had a lot of skin in the game, so a lot of bank capital in various forms, or the government had really strict regulations on what banks could and couldn't do and where they could and couldn't invest. And once you remove those two things, that's why we got the global financial crisis. That's why we had the banking crash that we did, because banks essentially, there was no restraints on them. They had no skin in the game, no regulation. And I don't know that we have actually put enough regulation upon banks. I don't know that we've pushed them to have enough skin in the game, Richard. But that would be my own personal view, and there are many people who would disagree with me on that.
That's fantastic, and I've now monopolised you enough and given Anna time to read the comments. So I should say this is really one of the strongest list of questions we've ever had. I'm very glad you said that. I have to say that leverage is so important, because I spent a lot of time today lecturing people about that. And I think the question may have been to sort of check that their lecturer was getting it right. If I may just add my own view, like Anata Mate is super influential. I've just spelled out her name for everyone so they can Google her and put her link down. I'll dig it out and put it up on my site. I've got a bit about crashes, but if you look into what actually happened at Royal Bank of Scotland, which was the world's biggest bank in 2008 after the ABN AMRO merger, there's a document which is called literally something like "What Happened at the Bank of Scotland, at the Royal Bank of Scotland" by the regulatory authorities, and the loss absorbing capital had got to below 1%. It was 0.9%. So today in class we did an example of somebody leveraged at a 10 times ratio, so 10% capital. So the biggest bank in the world had less than 1% capital. And if you think of what that means to how much you need to lose before you get into trouble, it's very, very scary. So that was the basis that we started from after 2008. And so when John says, even though we've gone a long way, when he says we might not have gone far enough, I kind of agree, because we started at an incredibly leveraged and risky position. But anyway, that's just a personal view. And back over to you, Anna, you're in charge.
Great, thank you. Okay, so as Richard said, thank you all. There's a fantastic discussion going on. And I'll remind you that if you want to save any of the links that Richard's posted up there, you can save the chat, and there's some lecture's going to go on YouTube tomorrow morning, hopefully. So I'm just going to start with a question from Katya. So we've had the book's called Boom and Bust, but at some stage there's a sort of tipping point where you go from boom to bust. What do you think lies behind that? Is there no grand socio-economic theory, or is there again a sort of common thread that we can find?
Okay, so it differs across different bubbles. And let's go back to the bubble triangle, because this is what we use to help explain why bubbles burst when they do. So why do fires all of a sudden stop? They run out of fuel. So all of a sudden, interest rates go up. The monetary authorities push interest rates up. All of a sudden, credit standards tighten. and that can be, all of a sudden that you've just run out of fuel, and so the bubble bursts. You can also then have problems with speculators. So all of a sudden, people are stopped, just the same degree of speculation is not happening. And that's just enough to tip, from the boom over into the bust. And it's such fine things actually do this. So we saw this, the Wall Street crash is a really good example of this. And, recent bubbles in China, again, really good examples of this. And all of a sudden, as people unwind their positions, and all it takes is one or two investors doing that, that can then trigger off other people doing it. And that can happen really rapidly. So those are the things. So the fuel runs out, or there aren't any more people to speculate, or the number of speculators just is diminished.
Thank you. Okay, so I want to take a question from Nick, and we've discussed the sort of definition of what a bubble is, and I think what Nick is asking is he gives a definition from Howard Marks that says a bubble kind of is an unreasonable optimistic psychology. I believe that there's no price too high for the bubble asset. Do you agree with this characterization, particularly in the sort of context of technological bubbles, or do you think there's sort of some sort of like middle ground between what you have written about and what Marx and also what Robert Schiller, who I know you talk about in the book, have sort of argued?
Yeah, that there's no price too high, but so that's a really tricky question, I think, to answer, because I think when a lot of speculators during these bubble episodes are buying, I don't know that they necessarily have some sort of price in mind that they want to get to, that they then want to exit at. I just think they're caught up in the sort of the zeitgeist of the period, and they're just like in buying these, and everyone's in the coffee shop talking about railway shares, and they're buying railway shares. The Times is writing about this, other newspapers are writing about it, and so they get caught up in that. And I'm not so sure that they're processing, what they think the share price ought to be, or where they should get off on the journey. They possibly think that this thing is going to keep going, but it's a really hard, to know what the fundamental value of a stock during at any point in time is really hard to measure, particularly during a bubble. So, I don't know if I fully answered that, Anna. I'm not 100% satisfied with my own answer there, but that's my answer.
It's a difficult question. Thank you, Nick. You've really stumped him. So I want to move on to the next question on my list, which, goodness, where am I? Which is from Barnaby. And so you said you sort of you said you were sort of wary around the subprime bubble and the dot-com bubble, but have you ever incorrectly believed that the market is in bubble, and why do you think you were wrong?
That's a really good question. Yeah, that's a really good question. I have made lots of investment mistakes. So a bit of a personal story here. So I was the first generation of students who could actually avail of student loans. It was in the final year of my undergraduate. And so they only came out towards the tail end of my final year, and I didn't need the money for my student loans, because back in those days you actually got a grant from the government to study. But I took out the student loan because it was, I was interested in finance, and it was someone was giving me money at 0%, I was going to take it. And so I invested it in shares, but I didn't invest it in the right company. I invested it in a company owned by Robert Maxwell, Mirror Group Newspapers. Richard probably remembers this. And Robert Maxwell, whose daughter is, caught in all sorts of issues over the United States at the minute, he fell overboard from his yacht, or was pushed overboard. Who knows what happened? And it turns out his companies were all bankrupt. He had raided the pension funds of his companies, and so I lost all my money. So that was a really important lesson for me early on in my investing career. So I've made investment mistakes for sure, but I don't know that I've ever not called a bubble. Everyone that I've seen, I've not invested in. Let me put it that way. I've sat out of that, and so I've not put my money. I put my money where my mouth is in that sense. because, one of the things I can write about these things, and it's really easy to write about these things, but then to actually invest, because I do have this side interest in investment, to invest when these things are going on is something else altogether.
Sorry to come in
there,
go
ahead.
John, and sorry if this is unfair, but we're reaching the end now, and just to sort of press you and make it a bit more discursive, do you sort of systematically short things though? So one of the problems that we have as investors and as human beings is sort of confirmation bias. So we sort of could potentially, and I'm not accusing you of this, but we could potentially sort of say, I thought that was a bubble and then it went down, and oh yeah, I definitely thought that was a bubble and then it went down. But I guess the kind of real test would be, are we so confident that we would short it? And this was asked by one of the people. Obviously, we don't want to ask too much about your financial position, but on some of these things that you think, look, that doesn't make sense, are you so confident that you would short Bitcoin in a kind of major way, or does the sort of potentially irrationality of these short squeezes, what we saw with GameStop, make you think, I'm confident it's a bubble, but there's no way I'm gonna put my own skin in the game on this?
Yeah. Shorting is super, super risky. And as an investor, I'm super risk averse. Because the thing with shorting, of course, is that you may well believe there's a bubble, and possibly there is a bubble, but it may not burst quickly enough for you. You may run out of funds, and you may face calls. And so if you read the Big Short, for example, it got really close for the people who were shorting, the US subprime bubble. For the people who are shorting it, because they were running out of funds. And that's the danger when you short things. You're also, because I've looked so much at short selling throughout history, you see this idea of being cornered, and you don't know what's going on behind the scenes. And so if you're short selling, you don't know if there's someone else cornering the stocks that you're trying to short. And so for all of those reasons, I avoid shorting. I'm a very much buy and hold, steady as you go type investor, Richard, and ethical as well. That's the other thing that I add into my portfolio selection.
And for those, I think there are quite a few people who are currently doing the booms and busts in the first year. For those that aren't, we'll put the material online, but we'll talk this week about cornering the market, which John referred to, which was a big part of the 1907 crash, which is one of the things that then led to the setting up of the Federal Reserve. So it's a key thing to understand. Back to you, Anna.
Great. Okay. As Richard said, we're sort of running out of time, but we might overrun a bit. We're probably sorry that if we don't cover your question, but we'll do our best. So I just want to sort of cover another question that asks, what is the optimal strategy if you believe that you've invested into a bubble? I guess for future investment bankers out there, that would be a useful question.
Okay, so if you have invested in a bubble,
I believe the question.
Yeah. So again, there's some anecdotes throughout the book where we talk about investors who get out, in good time, and so we start off the book with Handel. So George Frederick Handel invested in the South Sea Company in 1719, and he sold out several months before the bubble collapsed, and he made a handsome profit. So it's getting out of the bubble asset, or making sure that you're well enough diversified. That's one strategy. The other strategy is, if you think of technology stocks, you think of the .com. So a lot of people view .com stocks almost like lottery tickets. And so if you bought enough lottery tickets, you're bound to win big in one of them, or maybe two of them. So, you buy a diversified portfolio of all of these .coms. Most of them are going to lose your money, but on a few, you're actually going to make it really big. So the example we give in the book is, if you had bought Amazon during the .com boom and you still held Amazon today, you would be a super wealthy individual.
Yes, great. So a couple of questions, and I think we're going to end on this note about the role of technology. So as far as I'm concerned, there's one from Ollie, and I'm afraid I can't remember who asked the other question. But I think, so Ollie's question is whether new technology can help predict bubbles through like machine learning, that sort of thing. But I guess the inverse of that is, machine learning sort of creating bubbles like the flash crash that happened in 2010, I believe. And so what do you think, with this in mind, the sort of future of, do you think there are going to be any sort of like radical changes in the future with this new technology outside of, I guess, technological sparks?
Yeah. So listen, like, you take all the Reddit boards, all the social media, and Richard was talking about this earlier, all these, young investors, commenting on social media. You can bet your bottom dollar that the big investment houses have got analysts who are data mining that social media. And it's relatively easy to data mine it, just to use big data techniques. Like I've done it with historical press, with the Financial Times, so digitized the Financial Times from 1900 to 2010, and extracted sentiment, what are known as sentiment indices, that basically allow you to predict how the market's going to behave the next day and possibly the day after. And so you can bet your bottom dollar that there are institutions who will be data mining social media feeds and trading off the back of that.
So next week, thank you a great deal, Professor Turner. Thank you all for coming as well. We've had a really great conversation today. I hope John agrees, and I hope you all agree. Next week, we're going to have Bristol's own Professor Stephanie von Hinker, who will be taking a more interdisciplinary, I can't speak, approach to economics, and she'll also be talking about genetics, and I think, just genetics. Great. So please come to that. We'll post the links in the Facebook group, so please join that. We'll email it out to you again. And remember that all of the talks are available on YouTube, and you'll be able to watch this one on YouTube, hopefully by tomorrow, but definitely by the end of this week. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you'll
get hold of the book if you can. It's a fantastic book, and it's a great way to learn finance and macro.
Buy the book. Don't take my word for it. Take Richard's word for it, or take Martin Wolf's word for it. It's a great book. There should be a link in. There wasn't a link in the email, was there? But there's a link on the Facebook group that you can join. It's just called 2020-2021 Bristol Talks Economics. Hope that helps.
Thanks so much, John. That was absolutely fantastic. Really interesting.
Anna. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Anna.
I'm now going to watch Liverpool get played off the park, but there we go.
Good luck.
ups and downs, boom and bust.
Oh exactly. Well, it's all bust at the minute. But listen, thanks everyone. Take care.
Fascinating.